So I think there are three key criteria to determine whether or not taking this dynamic systems approach that we'll work on in this course are right for you. So one of them is, what's the nature of the environment you're working in? If you're working in a very dynamic, ever-changing, difficult to understand environment, this approach is probably right for you. There are certain signs of a complex environment, and there are things I think we know well, but sometimes ignore. So for example, there will be environments where people have tried answers or approaches that should have worked, but didn't. So when a linear sort of A should lead to B doesn't work, so sometimes A leads to B, but in other cases A leads to cantaloupes, and you're lost. When you're in an environment where problems just keep morphing, and so you feel like you got your hands on it at one point, but then it sort of morphs and becomes something else. When it feels like we can never keep up with the pace of change, so we're constantly being overwhelmed by events, and when answers that should have worked don't, or have worked in one place but don't work in a separate place, are all sort of indicators that we're in that complex adaptive environment. So if you're in that environment, key indicator that you should be doing this. The second one is, what's the nature of the goal? What's the nature of what you're trying to do? If you were trying to administer relief aid to people and keep a refugee population, let's say, fed for another week, or to house them so they don't die of exposure, that's a relatively mechanical kind of goal. Like we know how to do that, and we know when we do A, we do get B. We know when we deliver certain kinds of relief supplies, it actually keeps people alive. If your goal was to lessen the potential for violent conflict that would displace those people to begin with, that is probably a complex adaptive goal. In other words, there are many interlocking forces that are producing that, and what caused a violent conflict in place A may very well be different than what causes it in place B. So even what worked in A won't work in B. So if that goal is a complex adaptive goal, then you definitely should be taking this kind of approach. The other one is less about what's happening out there in the world and what's happening with you. If you're in a position to be able to step back, to really take time out and think through and do some analysis, and have the means to do that analysis in advance of building a strategy, then it's for you. So I sort of think of that, I call that kind of the enabling environment for you. So if you have the ability, the time, and the resources to step back and do this kind of analysis, it's worth investing in. One of the hard parts is when people think that using a systems approach is just going to be a faster way to get to some magic solution. If that's what you're in it for, maybe you should move on and do something else. It won't take difficult problems and make them magically simple problems. There's nothing that will really do that. What it will do is if you're grappling with a really difficult, intractable problem in a really difficult, complex environment, it will give you a better chance of actually doing something productive toward that goal and in that environment. In terms of who should use a systems thinking approach to social change work, I think it really depends on three things: the nature of the environment you're working in, the nature of the goal that you've set for yourself, and your ability to actually implement this kind of approach.